we talked earlier in earlier lessons about shooting in manual mode and understanding the exposure triangle. Now, once you understand the exposure triangle of aperture, shutter speed and ISO, you can start, in my opinion, to consider using the semi-automatic modes, which are aperture priority, shutter priority. They have different names on different cameras, but basically they are the same thing. I'm going to talk in this video about aperture priority and why you might choose to use it. Now, with aperture priority, you are choosing the aperture that you're shooting at, but you are allowing the camera to choose the shutter speed. So the camera will work out using metering, and we'll talk about the different metering modes in a different video. Now, if you know aperture priority is the most important thing for you, that you're controlling depth of field, perhaps you're taking outdoor portraits with a relatively still subject, and all you want to do is control the aperture yourself, and you trust the camera, you can let the camera select the shutter speed for you, but you need to understand the compromise that you're making. The camera may select the wrong shutter speed for you, but what it will do is it will keep the level of exposure quite consistent as the level of light changes. So, for example, if you're shooting in manual mode and you've put your camera in a 1/100th of a second shutter speed and you're shooting at f1.4 and it's quite cloudy, but then the clouds clear and the sun breaks through, you will find that those perfect settings you had before, suddenly everything's brighter than you wanted, and you will need to manually, you're in manual mode, move the shutter speed in order to keep the depth of field that you want by not touching the aperture. So shorten the length of that the shutter's open, let light in, to darken the image down a bit to get it back to where you wanted it. If you're in aperture priority mode, the camera will do that for you. Now, you could have the camera, as well as being in aperture priority mode, where it's selecting shutter speed for you, you would normally have selected the ISO, so you're keeping the image as clean as you want. But you can also, in most cameras, set auto ISO, where the camera also has the freedom to adjust the ISO. Now, most of the time, and this is what I would strongly recommend if you're going to use auto ISO, is that you set a maximum ISO so that your camera doesn't go higher than you want it to. Most cameras will go to the ISO early in their adjustment process because they know it alters less of the image as far as movement and things like that are concerned. Now, with most cameras, you can also set auto ISO minimum shutter speed. It's a fantastic setting if you're using aperture priority, for example. So back in that scenario, you're taking these portraits outdoors, and instead of getting brighter, it's got darker this time from when you started. So the camera wants to slow the shutter speed down in order to let more light in and keep the ISO at 100. But it's slowing it down to 1/15th of a second, which means any tiny movement in your hands is going to come through as blur in the photograph. But you know that you do not want the camera in any circumstances to go below 1/125th of a second, for example. What it will do then is it will raise the ISO because the shutter speed was going to go down. So it's a fantastic setting, but generally I would suggest that if you want to use aperture priority, stick at least in the beginning with a fixed ISO, maybe go slightly higher than you really want. Obviously everybody wants to shoot at ISO 100, but ISO 200 on most cameras is pretty clean, ISO 400 is pretty clean. Shoot a little bit higher to give yourself that little bit more flexibility and stop the camera from dropping the shutter speed too slow.